Colleagues and friends of former Wisconsin U.S. Senator Herb Kohl are honoring his memory. He passed away after a brief illness. The death of the Kohl's department store founder and former owner of the Milwaukee Bucks was announced yesterday. Kohl graduated from the University of Wisconsin, where today the school's basketball and hockey centers still bear his name. Kohl became president of the Kohl's Corporation back in 1970. Then he served as chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party from 1975 to 1977. After that, he served as a U.S. Senator from 1986 until 2013. One of his longtime friends, former Governor Jim Doyle, says he will always remember the late senator's work to save a senior health care program in Wisconsin.
This is something that largely went unnoticed, but he managed to get into a bigger congressional bill, something that saved the senior care program in Wisconsin, that protected the ability of hundreds of thousands of seniors in Wisconsin.
Kohl, the former owner of the Milwaukee Bucks, bought the team in 1985, promising to fans the Bucks would never leave Milwaukee. The team will honor him with an event soon.